I woke up on a Tuesday morning earlier than usual, not because of an alarm clock, but because of the silence. No footsteps on the stairs, no refrigerator door opening, no quiet arguing about coffee or tea like every other day. I lay still for a few seconds, staring at the familiar ceiling. The small crack near the corner of the window was still there. Robert had said he would fix it when he had time. In the end, he never got the chance. I pushed the blanket aside and placed my feet on the cold wooden floor, barefoot. Each step sounded louder than usual, as if the house had doubled in size overnight. I walked into the living room and froze. The sofa was gone, not moved, not covered, but gone. The small table where Robert and I used to drink Sunday morning coffee, gone. The floor lamp by the window, the only item I brought from our old house after my husband passed away, is also gone. I turned toward the dining room, the family dining table, gone. The wooden table where Daniel spilt milk when he was 5, where we blew out birthday candles, argued, made up and shared dinner together for decades. Only empty space remained. No chairs, no cabinets, no trace that this place had ever been a family home. Strangely enough, I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. There was only a hollow feeling spreading from my chest, cold and deep, as someone had quietly sucked all the air out of the house and out of me. If you're listening to me right now and feel your heart sink with each empty room, maybe this story touches you too. Here, we share the most honest family stories. If you want to stay and listen on, you are always welcome. I stood in the empty living room for a long time before remembering what I needed to do. I picked up my phone. My hand trembled slightly. Daniel didn't answer right away. He picked up on the third call. "Mom?" His voice sounded normal, even a little cheerful. "Daniel," I said slowly, "where are you?" There was a brief pause. Very brief, but I heard it. I'm out with Sophia." "Why is the house empty?" I asked. Not loudly, not accusingly, just a question. On the other end, Daniel exhaled. "Mom, we're sorry we didn't tell you first." "What do you mean?" "We sold a few things from the house." "A few things." I closed my eyes. "You sold my dining table?" Another pause. "It's just furniture, Mom." Daniel spoke faster, as if afraid I might interrupt. "Family matters more than material things, right?" I heard a very soft laugh in the background. Not loud, not openly cruel, just light. It was Sophia. "We needed money urgently," Daniel continued. "We're in Europe. Sophia has always dreamed of traveling, and I wanted to make her happy." "With money from my belongings?" I asked. "Mom, don't make this so heavy." He didn't say it was wrong. He only said that. I was overreacting, and then, before I could say anything else, the call ended. I stood there, phone in hand, in the empty house. For the first time in my life, I realized something. My son no longer listened to me, and I was no longer someone whose opinion mattered in my own home. 2 years ago, this house was not in this condition. I lived alone, but I was not lonely. Every morning, I woke up early, made coffee, and watered the plants on the porch. In the evenings, I read books and listened to Robert's old music. Then one day, Daniel stood at the door, my son, with a large suitcase and tired eyes. "Mom, can we stay here for a while?" Daniel said they had lost their rental place. Rents had gone up. Work was unstable. He said it would be just a few months. I looked at my son, the child I once held in my arms after my husband passed away, and I nodded. "Of course," I said. "This is your home." At that moment, I truly believed it. I believed a home was a place children could always return to. I believed love meant opening the door. I believed that as long as the family stayed together, everything would work out. I didn't know that from that moment on. I had opened the door not only to my son, but also to the erasing of the boundaries I once had. Initially, I told myself that everything was only temporary. Sophia said she was looking for a job. Daniel went to work and came home late. I continued my life as before, just with 2 more people in the house. But very quickly, the house began to change. Sophia stayed home almost all day. She woke up late and usually came down to the kitchen near noon, opened the refrigerator, took some food, and then sat on the sofa scrolling through her phone. The TV was almost always on. The sound filled the living room, yet it made me feel unnecessary. At first, I still sat with them. I asked a few questions. Sophia answered politely, but her eyes were always on the screen. Then, little by little, I stopped sitting there. Not because anyone said anything, but because I felt I no longer belonged in that room. I brought my books into the bedroom. I drank my coffee alone in the kitchen. The living room, once the center of the family, became their space. Daniel was different. He wasn't rude, he wasn't short-tempered, but he avoided looking at me. When I asked about Sophia's job, Daniel answered on her behalf. When I mentioned that the electricity bill was going up, Daniel said he would keep an eye on it and then said nothing more. My son was there, but he wasn't truly there with me. One afternoon, while I was washing dishes, Sophia walked into the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, stayed silent for a moment, then spoke in a lower voice than usual. "Do you ever feel like you're falling behind?" I turned to look at her. Sophia said her friends already had houses, cars, and traveled everywhere. She said she was tired of constantly worrying about money. She said she didn't want to live a life of struggle. "I'm just afraid of becoming nobody," she said, almost in a whisper. At that moment, my heart softened. I nodded. I said everyone goes through times like that. I said things would be okay. I didn't realize that while I was trying to understand and empathize with her fears, I was being pushed to the edges of my own life. Small things started happening. The chair I usually sat in was moved. The cabinets were rearranged. Things I always kept in familiar places suddenly disappeared, only to reappear somewhere else. No one asked me. No one explained. I wondered if I was being too sensitive, if I was overreacting. However, that feeling became increasingly apparent. I no longer felt like the owner of this house. I was someone living along with them, someone who stepped aside so everything could stay peaceful. And Daniel remained silent. That silence hurt more than any words ever could. That day, I came home earlier than usual. My mind was exhausted. All I wanted was to go upstairs, change my clothes, and lie down for a while. I walked quietly because the house was unusually silent. The TV was off. There were no voices. When I reached the bedroom, I stopped. The closet door was slightly open. I slowed my steps, my heart beating faster for reasons I didn't yet understand. And then I saw Sophia. She was standing with her back to me, head lowered, both hands rummaging through something in the corner of the closet. Not the upper shelves where I kept my clothes, but farther back where I stored a small wooden box, the jewelry box. I stood still for a few seconds before speaking. "Sophia." She startled and turned around. In her hands was the open box. Inside, my belongings lay scattered, no longer neatly arranged as they once were. I was just looking," she said quickly. "I thought the box was pretty." I looked down. My wedding ring lay on top, the ring Robert bought when we had nothing but each other. "Do you know this is private property?" I asked. My voice wasn't raised, but it was very clear. Sophia pressed her lips together. "I just thought, you don't really wear these things anymore." That was when I realized Daniel was standing in the doorway. He didn't say anything. He didn't step forward. He didn't ask Sophia to put the box down. He just stood there. I looked at my son. "Daniel." He looked away. "I don't think this is allowed," I said. "Why are you both going through my personal belongings?" Sophia spoke first. "I just thought that In the same house, nothing is really that private. And besides, if these things aren't being used, then... She didn't finish the sentence. Daniel exhaled. Mom, we were just looking. There was no bad intention. Just looking. I said nothing more. I stepped forward, took the box back, and closed the lid carefully. My hands were shaking, but I didn't let it show. These are my personal belongings, I said. Don't do this again. No one apologized. Sophia shrugged and turned away. Daniel followed her. I stood alone in the bedroom, holding the box in my hands. For the first time, I felt unsafe in my own home. Not because I feared being harmed, but because a boundary had been crossed. Quietly, gently, but unmistakably. That night, I placed the jewelry box at the very bottom of the closet, deeper than usual. Then I sat on the bed for a long time. I didn't cry. I thought about one thing. If today it was the jewelry box, then what would it be tomorrow? And I realized that once certain things are opened, they are never quite the same again. Following the incident with the jewelry box, a strange atmosphere prevailed in the house. No one brought it up again. No one apologized. Everything on the surface seemed normal, but I was no longer the same. I began to pay closer attention, not to find fault, but because I no longer felt safe. One evening, I was in the kitchen. I had just finished cleaning up dinner. Daniel and Sophia had gone upstairs. I could hear them talking. At first, unclear. Just scattered phrases. I was about to go up to my room when I stopped, not out of curiosity, but because I heard my name. This house is really big, Sophia said. With just her living here alone, it's such a waste. Daniel didn't answer right away. I stood still, one hand on the stair railing. Sooner or later, it'll be yours anyway, Sophia continued, her voice calm, not sharp. Very matter of fact. You're the only son. There was a pause. Keep your voice down, Daniel said. Don't let Mom hear. I heard everything clearly. Sophia laughed softly. I'm just stating the truth. And besides, your mom has a lot of savings. You told me that yourself. Daniel was silent. That silence lasted a few seconds, long enough for me to understand that he wasn't objecting. He just didn't want to say more. I don't mean anything bad, Sophia said. I just think we need to plan for the future, too. Yeah, Daniel replied quietly. I know. Just one word. Yeah. I couldn't listen anymore, not because they stopped talking, but because I couldn't bear to stand there another second. I turned back into the kitchen and sat down in a chair. My heart slowed, but it felt heavy. No plans were laid out. No clear scheme was spoken of. Just very ordinary, very familiar words. The kind of words people use when they quietly grant themselves the right to think on someone else's behalf. I realized the most painful part wasn't what Sophia said. It was Daniel's silence. My son didn't defend me. He didn't say this was my house. He didn't say my money was mine. He stayed silent. That night, I lay in bed for a long time. I thought about the years I worked without rest, about every bit of savings I set aside for old age, about the house my husband and I built, brick by brick. I also thought about Daniel as a child, about the nights I stayed awake when he was sick, about how I put him above everything else. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had never dared to ask before. Had I given too much and forgotten to keep the most essential thing for myself? From that night on, I knew one thing for sure. No one in this house still saw me as someone whose opinion needed to be asked. And if I didn't protect myself, no one else would do it for me. After that evening, I no longer saw things the same way. I still woke up early. I still cooked meals. I still asked after Daniel like a normal mother. But inside, I had changed. I began to notice things I had once ignored. The electricity bill went up. The water bill did too. Food in the refrigerator ran out faster than usual. I didn't complain. I simply wrote things down. A small notebook kept in the kitchen drawer. I wrote down the dates, amounts, and changes. Not to keep score with my son, but to understand what was happening inside my own home. I moved important documents into my bedroom, the house deed, bank papers, insurance documents. I didn't tell anyone. Every morning before going to work, I checked whether my bedroom door was locked. I had never done that before. I was afraid, not because I thought they would do something immediately, but because I was no longer sure who I was living with. Some evenings, I would sit in my room and listen to them talking in the living room. Laughter, clinking dishes. I felt like a tenant in my own house. I wondered when everything had turned into this. I was hurt, not because of lost belongings, but because of lost trust. Whenever Daniel hugged me before going to bed, I still returned the hug, but it no longer made me feel safe. In my mind, one question kept repeating: was my son truly still on my side? Sometimes I wanted to ask him directly, to say everything I was thinking, but I didn't. I was afraid that if I spoke, everything would shatter completely. I was afraid I would hear answers I wasn't ready to face, so I chose silence. Not the silence of weakness, but the silence of someone who is observing. I began to look at them in a different light, no longer just as a mother who only gives, but as a woman trying to understand where she now stood. At times, I blame myself. Had I been too easygoing? Had I grown so accustomed to sacrificing that I had forgotten I also deserved respect? Those questions didn't have immediate answers, but they were there every day, reminding me that if I continued as before, things would only get worse. I didn't yet know what I would do. I had no plan, no clear decision. I only knew one thing. I could no longer pretend that everything was fine, and I could no longer live in my own house as someone without a voice. That was when I began to wake up, slowly, painfully, but necessarily. I didn't change everything overnight. I did small things, quietly. One afternoon during my lunch break, I stopped by the bank. I spoke with a teller I had known for many years. I didn't tell her everything. I only asked simple questions about my accounts, about access rights, about how to protect my savings. She looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "You're doing the right thing," she said. "Many people come here when it's already too late." Her words weighed heavily on me. I changed my passwords. I requested that statements be sent to my personal email. I reviewed everything that was in my name, not because I didn't trust my son, but because I was no longer sure I was being respected. A few days later, I met with a lawyer, someone a friend recommended. We sat across from each other in a small, tranquil office. I told my story. No embellishment, no tears, just precisely what had happened. The lawyer listened, then spoke in a slow, deliberate manner. "Legally, this house belongs entirely to you. You have the right to set boundaries, and if necessary, you have the right to ask them to leave." My heart tightened when I heard that. "Ask my own child to leave?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "It's not about forcing them out," he said. "It's about protecting yourself." I left with a stack of documents in my bag. On the drive home, I had to pull over for a moment because my hands were shaking. I wasn't ready. That evening, Daniel came home late. He ate quickly, said a few words, then went upstairs. I watched his back as he walked away, my chest heavy. I wondered if doing this would make me a bad mother. I wondered if I was betraying motherhood itself. I had lived my entire life trying to be a good mother. I wasn't used to putting myself first. But then I thought about standing in that empty living room that morning, about the jewelry box that had been opened, about the words spoken behind a closed door, and I understood that if I did nothing, things would not improve magically. I couldn't sleep for many nights in a row. I prepared, yet hesitated. I moved forward, then pulled myself back. At times, I wanted to stop everything, to believe that with just a little more patience, things would work out. But a small voice inside me whispered, "If you don't protect yourself, no one else will do it for you." So I continued, not quickly, not loudly, just with steady steps. I didn't know how far I would have to go, but I knew I had crossed a boundary I had never dared to cross before. They returned late in the afternoon. I knew because my phone showed a message from the taxi company. I didn't rush. I turned off the sound, washed my hands, and wiped down the kitchen counter. Everything in the house had been rearranged neatly the way I wanted it. I sat down on a chair in the living room. The new chair, not expensive, but mine. The sound of a car stopping in front of the house. A car door is closing. Suitcases rolling along the stone path. I didn't get up. Then the sound of a key sliding into the lock. Once, twice. I could hear the hesitation in the twisting of the key. "It won't open," Daniel said, his voice tired. "Let me try." Another attempt. Silence. The doorbell rang. I stood up and walked slowly to the door. My hand rested firmly on the doorknob. When I opened it, Daniel stood in front of me, sun-tanned skin. His eyes still carried the excitement of the trip. Sophia stood beside him, wearing large sunglasses and a neatly styled hairdo with one hand pulling a new suitcase. "Mom," Daniel said with a faint smile. "Why won't the key work?" "Because I changed the locks," I replied. They both stared at me. Sophia took off her sunglasses. "What did you say?" "From now on, you're not living here anymore." Daniel frowned. "Mom, what's going on? We just got back." "You sold my belongings," I said, "without asking, without permission, and then used the money to travel." Sophia cut in. "We didn't do anything wrong. It was just furniture." "It was my furniture," I said, "in my house." Daniel exhaled, his voice lowering. "Mom, I know I messed up, but we're family." I looked at my son for a long moment. "You didn't lose a home," I said. "You lost the right to live here." Daniel stood still. I could see he didn't understand. "I'm your son," he said. "You can't just kick me out like this." "Family doesn't take each other's things without permission," I replied. "Family doesn't disrespect each other's boundaries." Sophia let out a small laugh. "You're making this a bigger deal than it is." I looked at her. "No," I said. "I'm just stopping at the right time." Daniel let go of the suitcase. "So where are we supposed to go?" "I don't know," I said, "but not here." No one said another word. The evening breeze moved across the porch. I stood straight, my hand still on the door. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small in my own home. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I simply stood there and said what needed to be said. And in that moment, I knew everything had turned to a new page. "We still have things in the house," Sophia said, her voice sharper. "You can't just make us leave like this." "I know," I replied. "Follow me." I walked toward the garage. They followed slowly. Daniel pulled the suitcase. Sophia walked behind him, no longer speaking. I opened the garage door. The lights turned on. Everything was there. All of their belongings had been neatly packed into large cardboard boxes, clearly labeled: clothes, shoes, electronics, documents. Everything was organized, nothing missing, nothing extra. Sophia froze. "What is this?" she asked, her voice suddenly much lower. "Your things," I said. "I had them packed, checked. Nothing is missing." Daniel looked around, his face turning pale. "Mom, how long have you been preparing for this?" "Since I understood that I was no longer being respected," I replied. Sophia stepped forward and opened a box. She flipped through a few items, then stopped. Her hands began to shake. "You don't have the right to do this," she said, but her voice was no longer firm. "I do," I said, "because this is my house." Daniel set the suitcase down and sank onto the garage floor. He covered his face with both hands. "I never thought it would come to this," he said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted to make my wife happy." "And you hurt your mother," I said. "You chose silence when I needed you to stand with me." Daniel didn't respond. He cried. It was the first time I had ever seen him cry like that as an adult. Sophia looked at Daniel, then at me. "You're cruel," she said, "after everything we've been through here." "I gave you a place to live," I said. I gave time. I gave trust. But I can't allow anyone to take away my peace. Sophia shook her head and stepped back. You'll regret this. I've regretted enough, I replied. Now I just want peace. I glanced at the clock. Tomorrow, I'll have everything here moved out. You can pick it up any time before then. Daniel looked up at me. Mom, are you sure? I nodded. Yes. No one said anything more. I went back into the house and closed the garage door. When it shut, I stood still in the hallway for a few seconds. I didn't feel relieved right away. I didn't feel happy either. I only felt that I no longer had to hold myself together, and I knew that from that moment on, there was no going back. After that day, the house became much quieter. No more suitcases rolling, no more small arguments in the evenings, no more feeling the need to shrink myself inside a familiar space. But this quiet wasn't entirely comfortable. In the first days, I felt sad in a very real way. In the mornings, I made coffee for one. In the evenings, I ate alone. There were moments when I reached toward the chair across from me, then remembered there was no one sitting there anymore. Daniel called me a few weeks later. He said he was working at a construction site. The work was heavy, the pay wasn't great, but he needed the money to get by. He didn't complain much. He just said he was tired. I listened. He didn't ask to come back. He didn't blame me. Sophia was different. I heard about her through someone I knew. Her work was unstable. Financial pressure. She had to stay temporarily with a friend. For a while, she didn't leave the house or reply to anyone's messages. I didn't feel happy hearing that, but I didn't feel satisfied either. This wasn't revenge, just the consequences of choices that had already been made. As for me, I learned how to live with myself again. In the mornings, I woke up a little earlier, opened the windows, and let sunlight into the house. I wiped down the new dining table I had bought. It wasn't like the old one. It held no memories, but it was solid. Some evenings, I would sit in the living room, turn off the living room lights, and leave only a small lamp on. I listened to music, or sometimes to nothing at all. I just sat there. I was sad, but no longer afraid. I was alone, but no longer lost. Sometimes I wondered if things would have been different had I softened just a little more. Then I remembered the feeling of standing in that empty house the morning before, and I knew I had done what needed to be done. I didn't cut my son out of my life. I simply reset the boundaries. Family doesn't disappear because of distance. Family disappears when respect is gone. I accepted that from now on, the relationship between Daniel and me would no longer be the same, and perhaps it didn't need to be. What mattered was that I was no longer trading my peace for the sake of holding on to an image of family that no longer truly existed. Daniel asked to meet me on a rainy afternoon. We met at a small cafe near my house. I arrived early, chose a table by the window, and ordered a cup of hot tea. The rain fell steadily, not heavy, but enough to slow people down. Daniel arrived later. He looked thinner than before. An old jacket, mud on his shoes. He looked at me for a moment before sitting down. "I'm sorry," Daniel said right away. No circling around, no excuses. I nodded. "Okay." He lowered his head. "I was wrong. I let things go too far. I didn't protect you." I stayed silent. Not because I didn't forgive him, but because I wanted him to finish. "I'm not asking you to let us come back," Daniel continued. "I just want you to know that I understand now." I looked at my son. For the first time in a long while, I saw him truly grown, not through words, but through the exhaustion in his eyes. "Are you doing okay?" I asked. Daniel nodded. "It's not easy, but I'm trying." I took a sip of tea. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here. But I can't live the way I did before." He understood. I could see it in the way he nodded, slowly. "I know," Daniel said. "I won't put you in a difficult position again." When we stood up, the rain had eased. Daniel opened the door for me, the way he did when he was little. A tiny gesture, but enough to soften my heart. We didn't hug, We didn't cry. We just stood there, each of us with our own space, but no longer strangers. I didn't invite him home, and Daniel didn't ask. Some relationships can only continue when everyone stands in the right place. Loving your child doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity, and being a child doesn't mean having the right to hurt the one who gave you life. One weekend morning, I woke up early, not out of habit, but because I had slept well. I made coffee, opened the windows, and let the cool breeze fill the kitchen. Sunlight rested gently on the new dining table, not like the old one. No memories, but clean and steady. I sat down, alone, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel empty. I remembered Daniel as a child, the rushed breakfasts, the evenings when the whole family gathered around the old table. Those memories didn't disappear just because the table was gone. They lived in me. Family, I realized, isn't found in furniture, but it also can't exist without respect. I don't regret opening my door to my son all those years ago. I only regret forgetting that love also needs boundaries. Since the meeting in the rain, Daniel has called from time to time. Not often, not for long, just to ask if I'm doing well. I answer. We stay in touch in a new way, slower, safer for both of us. I no longer wait for everything to return to the way it was, because I understand that some chapters in a family can only end. They cannot be repeated. What matters is what we learn from them. Older people don't need pity. We need to be heard, to be respected, to have the right to say no without feeling guilty. Family is not a place where you can take everything just because of the word blood. Family is a place where everyone knows when to stop at another person's boundaries. I took my last sip of coffee, stood up, and wiped the table. The house was quiet, but no longer cold, and I knew that even though my family was no longer the same, I was still living in an actual home, one where I am allowed to be myself.